Hey friends, Dustin here from Vintage King. Today it's my extreme pleasure to introduce Brad Lunde, president of TransAudio Group, to talk about all things ATC monitors. All right, Brad, so tell us a little bit about who TransAudio Group is. Tell us a little bit about your affiliation with ATC and just who you are and what's going on in your world.
Thanks, Dustin. Thanks for inviting me to be here. TransAudio is a distributor, and a lot of people don't really know what a distributor does. They think we're a dealer or something, and we're not that. What we are is we are essentially sort of the factory displaced. In other words, we represent what the factory would do if it was here. So we have inventory, we have the repair shop, we have all the parts to fix things, we have the technical information, we have the measurement capability, we try to replicate what ATC over there in England has. That's where ATC is located. But if a customer buys an ATC speaker, they can't be calling England for service, and they can't be asking England, who's on 8 hours different time than we are. We can't be trying to depend on them for information. They really need to call somebody in the US. So we provide all that sort of back end, and then we also provide the front end when we supply the dealers. The dealers can call us if there's stuff in stock. So in other words, we're sort of like the factory. We act like ATC USA for all the companies we represent. It's very similar story where we have a warehouse with stuff in it, and a dealer such as Vintage King could order it and get it, and we'll ship it. So that's what TransAudio is, and we've been specializing in that for about 23, 24 years. So before that, I've worked for JBL. Before that, worked for AFEX. Been a rep for 20 years before that. So I've been involved in so many different aspects of the business that I've probably made most of the mistakes to make. And we can be certain that we try to do things the right way, and we try to follow a methodology of working, of trying to do the right thing. So that's a little bit about TransAudio.
Awesome. And you guys are based in Vegas, correct?
We are here in Vegas, yeah. And Vegas is a good place to be because, real estate's inexpensive, warehouses are inexpensive, so the company itself doesn't need so much money to survive. It can live on a lot less revenue than, say, if we were in California or New York or Chicago. And so this helps a lot, and it's also a good central place to ship from. And, we're we're 1 day from LA, and we're 4 days from Nashville. So it turns out pretty well. Good spot to be.
Very cool. And then obviously people know and love ATC. They've been around since the 70s. And how did you first get involved with them?
Well, they came to visit me probably about 3-4 years after we started the TransAudio Group, and they were here for a trade show, and they came to visit because they were looking for a US distributor. And for a company like ATC that's in a small town in England, being able to figure out who the right distributor is extremely difficult from far away. So they generally go visit people. And they came to visit me and came to my office, and I remember that day, and it was Billy Woodman and his manufacturing manager, Bob Pauley, came and visited, and we talked about what to do. And the thing that appealed to me about ATC and got me really interested was that they were building all their own drivers. They were doing everything in-house, and that's the best way to control quality. Today, the speaker business is so different than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because back then, almost everybody built their drivers in-house. Nowadays, almost no one builds drivers in-house. So you have all these manufacturers who are buying parts from someone else, putting them in their speakers and maybe adding value through their amplifier or maybe their DSP or something, trying to find some way to make it better. But if you know about loudspeakers, you sort of know that it all starts in the driver. Once the distortion's in the driver, you can't take it out. And ATC tries to build the best drivers possible so that they don't have to take the distortion out. Billy is one of the last transducer engineers that also understands the marketplace. So he's a rare breed nowadays, and there's not many guys like that left. I think Raymond Cook from KEF was a similar sort of fellow, and there are a number through the years that had a similar idea. James B. Lansing was that guy as well at JBL a long time ago. So I like that about ATC, and so I only want to represent companies I believe in and that I think are offering something totally unique, and I think ATC offers a solution that is unlike anything else. Whether you like it or not, it's a different question. I just like the fact of the way they run their company and the way they go about things. They're very nice to me. They don't beat me up. They don't yell at me, which means they're honest people. They're good people. If they say they're going to do it, they do it. If they, they call me back, they pay attention. They service things well. So I think it's been a really good relationship now. We've been doing it for almost 20 years, and they've been really good to me, and I've tried to be really good for them.
Can you talk about how, at least what they've expressed to you, how the relationship pre-TransAudio Group and post-TransAudio Group, how the company has changed with having you guys on board?
Well, when we started with them around 2001, 2002, they had a much smaller product line. They only had the active 20, but it was in a metal cabinet with 3 feet on the bottom of it and made it a little awkward to put it on a meter bridge. And then it jumped up to the 50, 100, and 150, but not many people had ever heard those. So the 20 had some recognition in Nashville and elsewhere, and they made a really good, high-quality, high-power monitor that would be put in the wall called the 300, the 200 and 300, and it was around the time that John McBride was starting Blackbird, and he was a big ATC fan, and he invested in ATC right away. Actually, Vintage King was the dealer for that, and so he made his whole studio all these big ATCs, and what made the big ATCs so different than everything else is they were actually mains you could mix to, where before, mains had always been the speakers you play back for the artist. You could play them loud, and it would sound really cool, but it wasn't something you would use for mixing. You'd use your near fields or something smaller for mixing, but ATC was something you could mix to. So I remember John's first studio at Blackbird had a pair of 300s in the wall and nothing on the meter bridge. He was mixing to that. So I think their reputation was always for very high fidelity. I mean, they got involved all the way after they started in the early 70s in England, when they really had it in their head that what they wanted to try to do was to hit the target of how do you have really high fidelity, which the British were very good at, but with wide dynamic range, which the Americans were really good at. So they were trying to figure out a way to do both. And that's not an easy target to hit, because trying to do high power means you've got to be able to manage a lot of heat and deal with a lot of physical issues, physics problems that are really hard to solve. And then on the other side, to solve the audio problem, you had to sort of maybe develop new drivers. So at the very beginning of ATC, one of the things that started the company was Billy had this idea to build the mid-dome, the 3-inch mid-dome, the same one we see today. It's had multiple refinements, but that was kind of the genesis of ATC. They survived in the early days building OEM drivers for other people, mostly PA companies, mostly PA drivers, but Billy's passion was that mid driver and trying to build something of super high fidelity, very high definition, focusing on the mid-range, which is the part that translates. That's where all the vocals are, guitars, piano, everything that's important usually happens in the mid-range. So he had a part unlike anybody else in the whole industry.
You've touched on a couple of things, the mid-range drivers being the focus, everything is built in-house, really high-quality standard. Does ATC have an overall design philosophy?
Yeah, I think so, and that is that, first of all, the company is very science-based. In fact, sometimes I get frustrated because I'll ask them to do something that's marketing-related, like, could you change the color? Could you do put silver on it? Could you make the logo prettier? Something like that, and then they'll just roll their eyes and say, that doesn't help the way it sounds at all. And we don't want to spend money on things that don't affect performance. And so they're really oriented around measuring and testing how these results turn into something that sounds better. For a good example, the current engineering staff, which is Richard Newman and Ben Lilly, who's also been a part of the engineering department for a long time, now is a little bit more in sales, but they really don't have a group of salespeople. It's really just engineering driven. And when I was at the factory and they were developing the new ATC tweeter, Rich had 100 different tweeters on his desk that he had built by hand to try to test them all to see which one would behave correctly, which one would do what they wanted it to do. Well, that's a degree of work that was common a long time ago, but not anymore. And so here they're doing this thing that nobody else would do to hand make this tweeter. Most people would just say, buy a tweeter from somebody else because it's not that important. Well, ATC's philosophy is they have to build the best part they know how to build, which sort of forces research, forces development, forces them to try things that other people might not ever even get involved in. And a good example is the mid-range driver. Billy was very passionate about that. Almost no one supported that idea back when he started in '74. Nowadays, you can look in the industry and you see a whole bunch of companies have a copy of that mid-range driver trying to emulate that performance. So it takes time to change the marketplace. ATC isn't really that interested in what other people are doing. They want to just build the best parts they can and apply them with the right technical approach, meaning that it has to be linear phase, it has to have all these other virtues in the speaker to be an ATC. It can't just be something that sounds good and everybody likes it. That doesn't work for them.
That's a great answer. What does ATC stand for, by the way?
Acoustic Transducer Company. So there they are at the beginning with their transducers, building drivers, building speakers, and of course their acoustic transducers. And that's what they named it. It is a little bit of a technical name, but it sort of perfectly describes who they are. And shortening it to ATC makes it at least possible that people like me can remember the name of the company, right? So I think that's a interesting name that they have used all these years.
I think one of the most pressing questions myself, a lot of the people watching at home want to know, why invest in studio monitors?
Well, I think ATC has a strong feeling about that, which is what drove them to develop this range of studio monitors. But my experience is in going into the studios and talking to the guys that are actually making records and trying to figure out what it is they want, they're trying to identify what's wrong with their mix. Their work is really, for a lack of a better way of describing it, fixing the tracking. So the tracking's been done, maybe by them, maybe not, maybe by somebody else. And there's going to be all these raw tracks that now need to be put into finished form and now need to be mixed together and turned into a vision that represents what the artist wants or the producer or whoever's in control of this project. So trying to put this together from these raw tracks all the way to a finished product requires that you need to be able to see the elements clearly. And so what ATC really attempts to do is to build parts and drivers and speakers that give you such a high degree of resolution that if you just listen to it on these speakers, you'll hear everything that's not right about your mix, and it will sort of point you in the direction of what you need to work on. So if you're bass light, they'll sound really bass light on a pair of ATCs. If you're bass heavy, it'll sound that way. If the mid-range is wrong, if you got fret buzz, if there's a detail, if the room mics are out of phase, things like that will be very obvious on a pair of ATCs. And sometimes you'll even hear some of your creative work more readily, like you turn an EQ knob on a vocal. You'll hear that difference right away. The problem is with monitors is that distortion in a monitor acts like a cloak. It covers up detail. It obscures detail. So while the balance can be okay, like an NS10 is a perfect example. NS10 is a great speaker for balance and setting, you're going to get the bass and treble right, you mix to that, it's going to sound balanced on a really good system, but it's hard to hear detail sometimes because the speaker has a high distortion level, and depending on how loud the mixer plays it, it maybe has a whole lot of distortion in it, what he's actually listening to. ATC is designed to have as low a distortion as possible.
So Brad, you mentioned Billy Woodman a little bit earlier. What is his involvement still with ATC? Is he still a pretty big part of the company?
Oh yeah, very, very much so. I mean, Billy's obviously working from home a lot right now with the current situation, but he's consulted on all the major decisions through engineering department. I know for a fact that the engineering department calls him for advice constantly and is asking him his opinion on doing it this way or doing it that way. Engineering is such a matter of sort of, here's the science and then here's the set of trade-offs that we have to make. For example, if you want to make a driver that has better low frequency, you can't really make it as efficient. You give up a little efficiency for low end response. So you're building a woofer. So what do you want? You want more efficient woofer, or you want that plays louder with less power, or do you want one that goes lower? So questions like that are specific design issues that have to be addressed. If you're shooting for better low frequency response, then that drives what your design decisions are. Billy has this enormous experience with transducer design. Before he started ATC, he worked for a really well-known speaker company called Woodman's. It was one of the top speaker companies in England, and sort of during that time when British hi-fi was a big deal. And Woodman's had a whole team of transducer designers, and that's where Billy worked. So Billy learned a lot from all of that and was able to take that information and move it forward. Nowadays, transducer design is mostly happening at the OEM level, where most of that's happening, and OEM is so often driven by price. So, what an OEM driver manufacturer will face is a manufacturer calls them and says, hey, I need 1,000 drivers that does this, this, and this, and costs this. And ATC is very able, Billy has been, I've talked to him about this many times, he really doesn't care what it costs. He wants to build a driver that works right. And what it costs. And then you just add up your costs, figure out what it has to sell for, and that's it. And if you say to him, yeah, can't you trim $100 here? He'll just say, no, I can't. Unless you want a different speaker, I can take this driver out and put a cheaper one in, but I can't give you this performance for less money. This is what it costs to do it. So that's what I mean about engineering driven, where you follow the science. The science says you can do this. You test, you build something and you test it, you measure it, you see if it really works, you listen to it, you test it in your listening room, you measure it again, you try a little tweak, you see if you can make it better, you see if that change made it worse. So, when I'm in Rich's office and he's got 100 tweeters in front of me that he's working on, and he's trying to figure out what the material is inside the voice coil, this little, looks like a little cardboard tube that's a whole lot more than a little cardboard tube. And he's working for weeks on just that one element. So Billy's deeply involved in those decisions. So it's great to have that consistency over time, because, you know how it is. It's like when a great idea gets watered down by either people who want to sell stuff or people that want to market stuff, it can drift off track. We've seen a lot of really great pro audio companies be different in their later years than they were in their early years, based on consumer feedback and marketing research and all that stuff. ATC is really focused on trying to move forward the state of the art in engineering.
So what some people might not know at home, that other than the pro audio side of ATC, you guys originally started making hi-fi home stereo systems, and you're still doing that today, correct?
Yeah, that's right. In the US, the hi-fi business isn't as strong, mostly because they've had not the best distributor. Big distributors in hi-fi want lines they can make a lot of money with. So ATC didn't represent this huge profit potential, so they never had the best distributors in the US. But overseas, where they do the work themselves, they're about half and half pro and hi-fi. And hi-fi is a really big part of their business worldwide, and they do very well in it. And I think the thing that makes their hi-fi do well is the same thing in pro. If we think about a loudspeaker having distortion in it, and that distortion acts like a blanket or a veil or covers up details. If you have this really great recording that they've invested all this time into trying to build all these really clever little details in, think about, we're all dealing with musicians, and you think about how much time a bass player spends deciding what his strings are and his amp is and his bass is and all the different things. Well, you cover up all this detail in the recording and all those things are lost. They're not, you don't hear them. When you uncover those things, suddenly you're much more aware of the information that was really put in the recording to start with. And you get a much deeper sense of what the art really is. So, for example, we're talking about the 50. That was ATC's first sort of complete speaker. And ATC started right at the very early days with active. So active means moving the crossover before the amplifiers and having 3 different amplifiers inside of a 3-way, 1 for each driver, and a crossover at line level, not at speaker level. When they were doing that, one of their early customers was Pink Floyd, who was obviously very active in recording and doing a lot of recording that had a lot of detail in it. I mean, when you listen to Dark Side, I've had a chance to talk to Alan Parsons about it. He's playing all these tricks of phase, and he's doing stuff with the channels and the recording that was very clever for the day, and created all these images and things that are lost on low resolution systems. On high resolution systems, wow, it knocks your socks off. So that's a great example of, I think, why the hi-fi does well, and also an example of why people buy the Pro Audio. And while we have different models in hi-fi than in Pro, there are some models that are the same when you get to the higher end. ATC does believe that why should the consumer, why should the home guy not be able to hear it the way Tom Petty heard it? Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they be able to hear it the way Lenny Kravitz wanted you to hear it? Why shouldn't they hear it that way? And so that idea, I think, works, and I think that idea plays out, and I know that ATC does well with a lot of musicians who are trying to hear the most accurate picture they can of what happened in the other room, in the tracking room.
So Brad, going from initial conception, R&D process, what does it take to go from there to final design?
Well, it's a much longer process than most people would know. We can start with an idea for a loudspeaker, and it can take 5, 6, 7 years to bring that idea to fruition. I think ATC worked on the tweeter for five years before they were able to actually build them and put them in speakers. The idea of conception to delivery starts with a clear idea of what you're trying to accomplish. That's actually one of the hardest things of all, because if an engineer will talk to his sales department and say, well, what do you want? And the sales department will say, well, I want something better. And of course, that's very nebulous. Doesn't mean anything to an engineer other than different, right? So defining what it is you want to achieve is a big deal. In the case of ATC, when I say they're really focused on drivers, they have a sort of a clear mandate. They're trying to figure out how to strip every last bit of distortion out of the driver. So if the driver doesn't generate it, it doesn't end up in the final product. And once the distortion's in the driver, you can't get rid of it. No DSP, no acoustic software, nothing will make that distortion go away. You can maybe make the way the speaker sounds in the room a little better, but you can't fix the resolution, right? So that's the big thing. So everything that ATC does has to relate back to resolution. So let's say they have it in their head, they want to build, a better, well, since that's the most recent thing, a better tweeter. How does that start? First of all, it's like, what's wrong with the other tweeters out there? What do they measure like? So then you got to go measure tweeters that you're already buying to use in your speakers. You got to measure other tweeters that you can find on the marketplace. You got to figure out what problems that those drivers have and how they can be and how they have an impact on the music. So you test them, then you listen to them and see how they sound wrong, or see what you have to do to fix it, if you can fix it. And then you start coming up with an idea of how to solve the problem. A lot of times with speaker science, it's materials. And people wouldn't necessarily, most of us who want to listen to a hi-fi at home or listen to a speaker in a studio aren't thinking about what kind of exact shape of the copper in the coil it has to be to have enough power in the motor and to have enough ability to cool itself and to be able to be something you can actually repeat and build again and again and again. So there's all these sort of goals you have to achieve in trying to improve a driver. Drivers are physics riddles. I sit down with them and they start explaining stuff to me, and it just, it's unbelievably complicated. I was never that great at physics math, and it's all a physics issue. You can trade heat for, SPL. You can trade distortion for, this other component for durability. You have all these different things that you have to try to balance, which is why experience, most of the great transducer designers were apprentices and worked under someone else who taught them that doesn't work, this works, that works, try that, try this. And that really is the way that a lot of people understand this. It's not like you can necessarily go to a book that says, oh, if you have this problem, here's what you do. No, you have to do the research on your own, and it's science research. It's materials research, and I remember Rich telling me on the tweeter that he was trying all these different types of materials for the former that's inside the driver itself, whether Kapton was better, whether carbon fiber was better, whether aluminum was better, trying to figure out all these different materials and how they behave when they're put together in a tweeter. So, the thing that's frustrating being an engineer of a loudspeaker is 98% of the work you do ends up in the garbage can because it wasn't good enough. But all of that leads you to the 1 or 2% options that actually are better. And now you have to figure out how to build it. You can figure out how to create one, but now try to create 500 of them. That's a whole different thing in and of itself. So trying to go from a concept is defining what the concept is. What do you want to do? We could say, like with ATC's mid-range driver, Billy's concept was it has to have wide dispersion, it has to have low distortion, it has to cover a wide frequency band because he didn't want to have a crossover in the middle of vocal range, and it has to be reliable over a long period of time. So all those requirements is a tall list of objectives, and trying to create a brand new idea that's never been done before. And starting with this 3-inch mid-range, no one had ever really tried that in the way that ATC did, and Billy was able to perfect that idea. And even to this day, ATC builds the best mid-range dome money can buy. I mean, there's nobody else has anything that's remotely similar. There's other ones out there. I mean, here, good example. Let me show you. This is an ATC. This is a cutaway, so it's a little. There's some doping on the cover, so it sort of attracts dirt. But this shows you, ignore the cutout, sort of what an ATC mid-range looked like. This is what, this is what the motor is. All this stuff below here, and this is the dome mid-range right here. But when I turn it and I show the inside of it, right? There's so many technical issues with how that's put together. A dual suspension. This is a small gap and a very big coil. This is, a small coil and a very big gap. And you have all these other issues about how does this thing stay linear as it moves up and down? And then how is the pole created? How is the cooling accomplished? There are so many issues to address that it's mind-boggling. This is not a freshman effort. This is a sort of a masterclass. And here is, and I don't really want to pick on anybody else because everybody has a different goal. This is somebody else's dome mid-range. So, this weighs less than our tweeter. So the power in the motor is less than our tweeter power, this is going to have more limited dynamic range, and it's only a single suspension. It's not going to have the same sort of linearity as an ATC does. It also costs probably, 20% of what the ATC costs. So if you're trying to build a speaker for a more attractive price, you can't do what ATC does. You just can't do it. You have to do something else. So it isn't like these other ideas are wrong. It's just that they won't accomplish what ATC wants to accomplish. So concept to completion, you have to be able to go to know what you want, and then you have to be resolute that you're going to achieve that, even if it costs more. And you have to be willing to put in the time to develop that. You can't just cut that corner short.
Excellent answer, man. So jumping off of that, looking at the range of ATC monitors, as you were saying, you get what you pay for. Where do you start in the line with some of your near fields, and where do you end up with some of your mains?
Okay. ATC's, like most companies, is broken up into groups where they have sort of near fields, mid fields, which are stand-mounted larger speakers you could put in a studio and move around, and then far fields, which are typically envisioned to go into a wall, to be soffit mounted. And so there's 3 groups there. Within that group, ATC goal is to have them all, it may sound odd, is to make them all sound the same. So how do you get a little two-way to sound like it's the same sound quality and character as this mega far field 3-way that costs, $60,000, and this little two-way costs $6,000? How do you maintain sort of a linear sound quality to them? What ATC shoots for is that as you go up in price, as you go up in size, what you should be able to gain is wider bandwidth, goes lower primarily, has better bass, and then also has a wider dynamic range, or you could say plays louder, has the ability to play at louder and louder levels. We sort of finish up our speakers at around 118 dB max SPL, which is not a sound level you want to be standing in front of when myself, I wouldn't want to do that. That would damage your hearing for sure. But the goal is to be able to play loud enough that a mixing engineer, who's quite often used to having an artist walk in the room and say, hey, turn it up, I want to hear it. Can he turn it up, or does the speaker crap out? He needs to be able to turn it up. At the same time, when you have a digital source, which has extreme dynamic range, you have to have a speaker that can handle distortion-free these huge peaks and still have the resolution at low level. We want our speakers to sound the same at low level as high level and maintain consistent performance all the way in between. So trying to achieve that within these different groups is a challenge. So in the near fields, we start with a passive 2-way called the SEM12. And that is the simplest speaker we make, passive. You got to hook an amp up to it. And it's not available in an active form, and it has a 6-inch driver and a 1-inch tweeter, both made by ATC, both made in-house, crossover made in-house. And they put those together in England in the same factory. They're making all that other stuff and box it up and ship it to me. Those speakers sell for, less than $2,000 in the US for a pair. And the goal is to make a speaker that has as wide a bandwidth as possible and a pretty big power band. You can play it pretty loud. As you step up, you want to get higher quality. What's the next step? Well, we go to the 20, which uses a really special driver that ATC designed and invested a lot of effort into. I actually have that driver here. It's this SL driver. This is our 6-inch driver, and as you can see, it has a massive motor on the back of it. And this driver is probably one of the lowest distortion 6-inch drivers available in a studio monitor, and that's a cutaway version. You can see the inner workings of it. The goal of this monitor, of this speaker, and this monitor, the 20, is to improve on the resolution of the 12. So I want to hear more detail. I want to hear more fine details. It doesn't go lower. This speaker in the ATC 20 probably rolls off at 85. But there's much to say about the important part of a mixer's work of trying to build music. Important part of that work is developing a speaker developing a sound that translates. What are our mediums we're playing back on? Car radio, earbuds, computers. The only part of the audio band that translates through on those formats is mid-range. So having a speaker that has awesome bass is going to be lost on all those playback mediums. You can have all this awesome top end, again, lost on the playback. If you don't get the mid-range right, you're done. It's over. Speaker, if you can't get the mid-range correctly, that music or that vocal or that narration or that movie will not sound good on the playback mediums available to the average consumer. You know, I don't know about you, but I often listen to stuff on less than ideal speakers in my office or at work or on the road. And so focusing on the mid-range in the near field is really a big deal. As near fields were really designed to get the room out of the way, meaning if the room is affecting all these speakers as much as it does, get the speakers away from all the boundaries and close to you, sit in a little equilateral triangle that tries to get the direct sound to be more higher level compared to the reflected sound. If you have wide dispersion, you need to be able to move around within that sound field and hear the same thing. So wide dispersion is a big deal for ATC with all their speakers. So the 20 has wide dispersion just like the 50, the 100, the 150, and it has a resolution just like those speakers as well. And above the 20, you also have the active 20. So there's a passive 20 and an active 20. The active 20 moves into the active range where you start to gain the benefits of an active approach where you can adjust each driver and its amplifier for linear phase. So you can have a speaker that measures perfectly phase flat. You can do all kinds of things with trying to control the size of the amplifier so it's exactly the right size for that exact driver. So you can make a bigger bass amp and a smaller tweeter amp. You don't need to spend extra money on this gigantic amp that does both and loses a lot of energy through the passive crossover. You can build it so it's really directly related to the driver. You can also have very short speaker cables. So active really steps up the game even further and improves the resolution even more. Once you get above that near field, the 20, then you go to the 25. Now we step into a near field that's a three-way instead of a two-way. Now you get the ATC mid-range and an ATC woofer and in a smallest possible package you can put on a meter bridge. So the 25 was really a speaker that has been a game changer for a lot of people because this compact three-way idea, but high resolution has really helped a lot of people sort of understand ATC's approach to this thing. And then we just, not all that long ago, a number of years ago, introduced the 45, which is a larger version of the 25 with two woofers and higher output, bigger box, more bass, and plays a dB and a half or 2 dB louder than the 25 does. So you have this very consistent range. If you listen to the 25 and 45, they sound really similar. You listen to a 20 versus a 25, mid-range sounds very similar, but the low end is different in the 25 versus the 20 because it goes lower, and so on. As you jump up then to the next range, same thing. More bass, plays a little louder, but the quality should be equal and should sound just as clear as you move up. I mean, I think the idea that ATC gets right there is that the thing that was always frustrating to me back years ago when I worked in a hi-fi store is that, you know, I'd like this speaker from a manufacturer. I thought it sounded really good, and I'd buy the next model up. Sounds like a completely different, what is this? It's not a different model. It doesn't sound anything like that one. And now I can't move up because this sounds different. I don't like the way that sounds. I like the way that one sounds. Or you find one and you got to jump up 2 or 3 speakers to get one that sounds like the little one that you owned for a long time you thought sounded great. So developing a line that has consistent sound quality throughout is really a big challenge and something that ATC, it's a virtue ATC puts a lot of time into. Okay, when you get to midfields now, that sort of starts with the 50, the ATC 50, which is the original speaker that ATC developed and still one of Billy's favorite speakers, and has become very popular with our top artists and top engineers. There's a lot of people who have bought 50s through the years and depend on them. So 50s are a 9-inch three-way and have twice the amplifier power on each driver. The Pro models are only available in active, so we have a 9-inch three-way called the 50, and roughly it corresponds to a 50-liter cabinet. And as you move up to the 100, it's a 100-liter cabinet with a 12-inch woofer, and the 150 is a 150-liter cabinet with a 15-inch woofer. The mid-range tweeter and amplifiers are all the same between those models. What changes is the woofer, the cabinet size, and how loud they play. And so the performance is significantly better as you move up, so that when you get to the 150, you're getting ATC's sort of vision of the best sounding speaker we know how to make, right? And the 100 is as close as we can get to that. But it's going to have a little less bass. And the 50 is as close as we can get to the 100 with a little less bass, right? So that's sort of the best way we can think about the midfield. So a lot of people buy midfields and never go beyond that because they're moving around too much. They don't want to put a speaker in the wall. But in a lot of commercial rooms, you don't want to have speakers you have to constantly move because the clients are endlessly fussy about how the rooms are set up. It's just better to have the speakers in the wall. It's also safer, and it also gives you the benefit of once you soffit mount them, you get the extra gain of putting it in a soffit. So all of that means that ATC 300s are very popular in commercial rooms that are looking for very high resolution. So for example, we were talking earlier about Blackbird. Blackbird used 300s in all of their rooms, and a lot of people come in and rent those rooms, of course, because it's a commercial studio, and they bring their own speakers with them, and a lot of people bring their own speakers and still mix to the ATC 300s in the wall. Some people use subs, some people don't. It's the 300s in the wall that are really sort of the reference. And that speaker, the far field 300 and its little brother, the 200, the 300 is two 15s, that same ATC mid-range, but a super dome. It's got a bigger motor yet. And then a tweeter, a very high power tweeter, and outboard amplifiers because we need more power now. So it's still active, but the amplifiers are outboard because we need some fan cooling and we need to remote the amps to make sure they're not making noise in the control room. Our 50, 100, 150 are passively cooled. They don't have any fans. So once you get to the far fields, then you get sort of the highest SPL we are capable of in a similar monitor, but can be wall mounted. So Blackbird's used a lot of 300s, and John has been a great supporter and is a great guy. He and Martina have built quite a thing there. The new Atmos room there is crazy, right? We can talk about that a little bit later if you like. And the goal there is, again, high resolution. If you can hear everything you're doing in the studio, you then can make the right decisions about what you want to do as an artist or as an engineer. If you can't hear everything, if it's covered up because a speaker covers it up, well, you're probably working with partial information. And that isn't, you may be successful at it, right? I've met a lot of very successful engineers that mix on what I think are terrible speakers and do these amazing mixes, right? So I don't know how they do it. I'm always amazed when I walk into a room with an engineer who's mixing on a kind of a crappy pair of speakers and it has all these incredible mixes to his credit, how he does that. But those guys are sitting in that room doing that 8 hours, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. They know things I'll never know, right, about the way it should sound. ATC is designed to make it easier for the average person to hear what's wrong and to fix it so your customer, your client, the artist you're working for, the producer you're working for, does not hear the error that you heard and now can fix. So the goal, whether it's the near field, midfield, or far field, is to bring that same level of performance to all those different sort of positions or perspectives or SPL levels. We want to make sure that you get the same benefit out of every single ATC speaker. So that's kind of a walkthrough of the range. We also make a line of subs, which are typically custom made to go on the wall with our larger speakers. We have a 15-inch sub, which is used quite frequently in our Atmos rigs and in surround rigs. So that follows the same sort of philosophy, goes very low, is high power. And they are always working on new ideas to try to improve all that.
So while it's still fresh in our minds, just talking about Blackbird, you guys were obviously involved with the installation of their incredible Dolby Atmos room. What can you tell us about that?
Well, John always wants to do things first class, and he decided to make this Dolby Atmos room. He wanted to build the best one that was available in the country. And so he, of course, supplied the same speakers he's been using in other rooms, ATC 300s as his mains, and then used ATC 100s for all the surround channels, lower and higher. So there's literally, 6 pairs of 100s in that room for the lower and upper front, mid, and side surrounds, and then 4 subwoofers. It's an awesome system for sure. Awesome system. And so what he kind of did there was to get the same level of resolution you could get in one of his other rooms, but in this Atmos rig, which not many people have ever heard before. So he's got a different set of clients, right, that come in there and want to work. And of course, we know about the moves by several of the record companies to want to start remixing things in Atmos. What I like about it, the reason I think it's important is because it's the first way we have of playing back and working in 3 dimensions with audio. Everything up till now has been really 2 dimensions. If we think about front to back and left to right, that's just 2 dimensions. That's a partial representation. 3 dimensions gives us the up and down, which gives us everything we need to create a 3-dimensional space. So, in being in that room, trying to get all the speakers to blend together so that you don't hear a gap between them is a challenge. And trying to get, so the ATC wide dispersion approach really works well in that format. The room itself, which is George Massenburg's idea, I call it the infinite reflection room that just makes things image in there like you've never heard before. It images so well. You can hear things almost precisely in space. It's really quite phenomenal. So he wanted to build the best Atmos room, and we took a crew down there, and we took our test machines down there. Ben from ATC came. We sort of pulled out all the stops to make sure we got this right for John, because he's been such a good supporter. And, it came together really well. Once the speakers were hung up, once everything was put in the positions that Dolby told us it needed to be in, and we got it close, we then went to work on trying to get them to sound right, aiming and adjusting levels, trying to get the whole system to act like one system. So it was quite a challenge to try to get that to happen, but I think the results are phenomenal. I remember listening to Prince, When Doves Cry, that was mixed in the room that morning, was amazing. It just sounded like a new way to hear the music. It didn't sound gimmicky to me. It didn't sound terribly artificial. It just sounded like the record, but pushed out to 3 dimensions. Like if Prince had had an Atmos system to work on, I feel like that's what he would have done, right? It sounds like his mix, right? It sounds like what he would have done. And the other mixes I've heard in that room, some of them are, it's true, some of them kind of are a little fancy, but a lot of them just sound like a 3-dimensional playback of music. It's really pretty exciting that for all of us as listeners soon at home, when we're able to have an Atmos system at home, we'll be able to hear movies and music in this 3-dimensional format. I know a lot of musicians are talking about it and wanting to have their music mixed for this format.
Very cool. So since we're doing this interview remote, obviously I would love to be filming you guys at TransAudio's headquarters out in Vegas. But what are some of the challenges and what are some instances where TransAudio Group, ATC, have, kind of risen to the occasion of, everything that's happening in the world? And what kind of challenges have you guys faced?
Yeah, some of the challenges were just sort of logistic. I mean, I didn't really even think about how many problems would arise with fewer airplanes because nobody's traveling, and all this freight that moves back and forth between the United States and UK on airplanes would affect us so much. So we've run into a lot of delays in just getting inventory from the UK, from the factory. But in terms of operating here, we all kind of we're sort of split half and half here, half at home. And we have several guys in the field like David and Zach who cover territories on site in the Midwest and East and the West Coast for us. It's been an issue of really just trying to communicate via Zoom and other methods with customers, with dealers. But the biggest challenge has been trying to provide the right amount of tech support over when you can't walk in a studio and hear it. So there have been times where we had to go visit a studio anyway, with masks and do all that stuff. Strangely enough, the thing that's happened is so many people moved from their professional studio or commercial studio to working at home on the mixing, tracking, and mastering side. Our ATC sales exploded. We sold a lot more ATC than we ever did before as people moved home, especially ATC 25s, people that had a big system at work and they wanted to move home and they tried to get the thing that would fit in their living room or their den or whatever at home, and they'd buy a set of 25s. So we saw a huge explosion of sales in 25s. And it presented some problems for the factory because, of course, the factory had to go by the rules of social distancing and all that to work. Fortunately, they were allowed to work through the whole pandemic, but they were on half staff because of these requirements to have all this social distancing. So their production rates became smaller, and the factory sort of put all their energy into trying to help us meet these orders in the US and did a pretty good job. We were able to keep up pretty well with the demand, but not great. We had some times where we had, some people waited 2 months, which was too long. We don't really want to see somebody wait that long for a set of speakers. But when they're built to order, there's no way to rush it. There's no way to make it take a week when it takes, a couple months. You got to build the drivers. You got to put the drivers together. You got to then test them. They then have to go in a box. You got to build a box. You got to build it together. You got to test that. I mean, it takes a process to put together a set of speakers that takes a while. And since nothing is machine made, we don't just walk to a room and it comes off an assembly line. Somebody has to build it. If you have a half staff, then all of a sudden you're building fewer. You have less. So it's presented some challenges in that, but I'm really pleased with the way ATC sort of focused on trying to figure out how to keep production as high as possible and to fulfill the orders that we were able to have to help these people move home. There's a lot of people, this has really upset their whole working life, and especially for the people in the audio business that are mixing and mastering and working in this, it's been challenging to figure out how to do what I used to do in a studio in a living room or a bedroom or a basement at home.
Even though the future is sort of unclear right now, what can you tell us what's next for ATC?
Well, they're continuing research on pretty much all fronts. I know that they're working on new drivers as well as new speakers, but the timelines for that are stretched out into the future. I don't see anything new in monitors from ATC coming in the next year or even two. I think the line as it is right now is pretty good. I think it makes a lot of sense. I know one thing that they'd really like to do is the tweeter, the new ATC tweeter that we have in just about everything. We don't have a super high power version that goes in the 300s. We're still buying Audex tweeters, which is a higher power tweeter that we use in that particular monitor. ATC would like to use the ATC tweeter in the largest monitors, so there's work going on trying to build one of these tweeters that can work at super high level. That is a very challenging task. I know engineering is working on that, and I also know that they're working on trying to figure out, experiment with ideas to improve, smaller subs. How do you make a better speaker? How do you improve performance in the existing speaker? So there's a lot of work that happens that's sort of process related that stretches over a long period of time. So I think the next new thing we'll see is an improvement to the 200, 300. And then beyond that, I'm not sure which one will be the first thing we're going to see. Maybe an improvement to an existing model. We'll see what happens. I know one thing I'd like to see is the installation range. With Atmos, we were just talking about that. People are now having to install speakers onto walls. Forget the upper speakers. How do you do that? Well, to do it safely, you need speakers that have reinforcement inside so that they're, that they properly tie the driver to the steel, to the connector, and that connector is attached to the wall in a secure way. ATC is doing a lot of work on developing, speakers that will be developed like in the smaller ranges that can be mounted on walls, an installation version of some of these studio monitors that we build. So that's something that's going on.
All right, Brad, well, I think that's our interview, man. Thank you so much for taking the time today. We've been meaning to do this for a while, celebrating ATC, obviously one of our best-selling monitor brands that we carry. So thank you so much again for the insight.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate all that you guys do, too.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to Mr. Brad Lunde, president of TransAudio Group, distributor for ATC monitors, giving us everything we need to know about the company. If you have any questions about ATC, feel free to visit us at vintageking.com, hit up your audio consultant, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you guys next time.